The morning sun cast a soft golden glow over Asheville, North Carolina, painting the quiet streets and lush hills in hues of amber and green. In the backyard of a large Victorian-style house on the edge of town, Laura Whitman sat beneath a wooden pergola with a cup of coffee in hand. It was Saturday, one of the rare mornings she allowed herself to stop, breathe, and exist without urgency. The gentle breeze carried the scent of magnolia blossoms, and for a fleeting moment it felt like peace. Yet, even in the calm, her mind refused to rest. Laura was 42 and the CEO of Whitman and Company, the company her father had built from the ground up. Since his passing 5 years ago, she had carried the weight of that legacy alone. She had taken a modest regional business and turned it into a national player, signing contracts that tripled their revenue and brought them to the brink of international expansion. And now, a deal worth tens of millions, one that could change everything, was only days away. She sipped her coffee slowly, trying to push away the familiar tension tightening her chest. "Morning," a voice called from behind her. Thomas stepped onto the patio, holding 2 steaming mugs. "You're up early for a Saturday." "Big week ahead," Laura replied with a tired smile as she accepted the cup. "I need to clear my head before the meetings start." "You'll nail it," he said, kissing her hand before sitting beside her. But before she could answer, the roar of an engine shattered the morning quiet. A silver Mustang screeched to a halt in front of the house. Moments later, their son Ryan stumbled out, still wearing last night's clothes, sunglasses hiding bloodshot eyes. Loud music thumped from the car as he sauntered toward them. "Another all-nighter?" Laura asked, setting her cup down. "Mom, I'm 20. I don't have to check in every hour," he said, planting a quick kiss on her head as if that excused everything. "Anyway, I need some cash. Can you transfer it today?" Her jaw tightened. "Have you even been to class this week? Or are parties your new full-time job?" "Ugh, here we go again," Ryan groaned. "I have an art show coming up. It's important. I just need some funds." Laura sighed. "Fine. I'll send it later." She rose and walked back inside, the weight of disappointment heavy on her shoulders. In the shower, as warm water cascaded down her back, her thoughts drifted to the cracks in her life she had tried so hard to ignore. Thomas had been out of work for years, spending endless days in his garage-turned-studio, painting canvases that never sold. And Ryan, bright, full of potential, seemed determined to waste every opportunity he had. Laura had bailed him out of trouble more times than she could count, even pulling strings to keep his reckless behavior off his record. Yet neither of them seemed to care about the sacrifices she made. Later that afternoon, she met her 2 closest friends, Charlotte and Ella, at a downtown bistro. They greeted her with champagne and laughter, a stark contrast to the heaviness Laura carried. "How do you manage everything?" Ella asked between bites of steak. "By forgetting I exist outside of work," Laura replied with a wry smile. "Meanwhile, one of my boys spends his days painting, and the other thinks future is a dirty word." "Cut them off," Charlotte said bluntly. "Let them figure out life on their own." "She's right," Ella added. "I saw Thomas with someone recently. Young. Stunning. How long are you going to keep tolerating this?" Laura forced a smile, though the words cut deeper than she let on. "Maybe you're right," she whispered. That night, as she returned home, the house was dark and silent. Thomas was in the garage, and Ryan was nowhere to be seen. Laura stood in the foyer for a long time, staring at the family photos on the wall, pictures of a life that looked perfect from the outside but was crumbling within. By dawn, her resolve had hardened. This week's deal would secure the company's future, but something else had to change, too. She couldn't keep carrying everyone on her shoulders while they dragged her down. Something had to give, and soon. Sunday morning unfolded in a soft haze of light over Asheville. Laura woke before dawn, her heart beating faster than usual. Today wasn't just another business meeting, it was a turning point. The deal she had been preparing for over the past 6 months was finally about to come to life. If things went well, Whitman and Company would no longer be just a respected regional firm. It would become a player on the global stage. She brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and watched the sunrise from her kitchen window, letting the steam warm her hands. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, eyes sharp, shoulders squared. There was exhaustion there, yes, but also a quiet fire. Thomas wandered in, yawning as he poured himself some milk. "You're up early again," he said, half amused, half indifferent. "It's an important day," Laura replied, offering a faint smile. "I need to be sharp." "You always are," he said, kissing her cheek before disappearing into the garage. No mention of the meeting. No offer of luck, not even curiosity. As always, his world revolved around his paints and canvases. By mid-morning, Laura had dressed in her favorite navy suit, the one that made her feel unshakable, and driven downtown to a small waterfront restaurant where the meeting would take place. Daniel Harper was already there, waiting near a window table with a panoramic view of the French Broad River. "Laura Whitman," he said with a grin as she walked in. "I almost didn't recognize you. You've become formidable." She laughed, genuine and unrestrained. "It's been, 20 years?" "Closer to 25, he said as they hugged. "Back, when you used to beat me in every debate club competition." "And you never let me forget it," she teased. Their laughter melted the tension she'd carried all week. When they sat down, business quickly took center stage. Daniel had built his logistics company from scratch, and his network could open doors Whitman and Company had never even dreamed of. They spent hours reviewing contracts, debating clauses, refining terms. They pushed and pulled, like two seasoned professionals who respected each other's sharpness. Finally, Daniel set his pen down and signed. "To new beginnings," he said, extending his hand. "To the future," Laura replied, shaking it firmly. Relief flooded her chest. This was the moment her father had dreamed of, the legacy she had promised to continue. To celebrate, Daniel suggested they stop by a small wine bar nearby. Over glasses of Cabernet, they drifted from business talk to childhood memories. Summers spent biking through town. Stolen afternoons at the creek, the day Laura fell off her bike, and he carried her home with a scraped knee and a crooked smile. She hadn't laughed this much in years. "You always had this fire in you," Daniel said, watching her with a warmth that made her heart ache. "I'm glad the world gets to see it." She stared into her glass. "Some days, I feel like I've lost pieces of myself along the way. Then maybe it's time you started finding them again." Those words lingered as Laura drove home that evening, the city bathed in twilight. But the warmth from the afternoon dissolved the moment she stepped through the door. The house was quiet, too quiet. She walked upstairs and paused at the threshold of Thomas's studio. The memory struck like a physical blow, the first time she had opened that door and found him with another woman. Their laughter, their whispered words, the casual betrayal of decades of marriage. It had been seared into her bones. And it wasn't just once. Even after confronting him, even after giving him chances, the betrayals had continued. Each time, she had swallowed her anger for the sake of their family. Each time, she had told herself it was a mistake, that he would change. But he never had. Laura closed the door and pressed her back against the wall, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was tired of carrying a husband who refused to grow up and a son who treated her like an ATM. She had built an empire from the ground up while they squandered everything she gave them. And for what? That night, she stood at her desk long after midnight, looking over the household accounts. Tens of thousands spent on Ryan's parties, cars, and projects. A steady stream of money funneled into Thomas's failed art. Her jaw tightened as she opened a new spreadsheet and began making changes, canceling automatic transfers, freezing non-essential accounts. If they were ever going to grow up, they needed to feel the weight of responsibility. And if she was ever going to breathe again, she needed to stop carrying them. The pen hovered above the final entry before she pressed down firmly, signing her name. It was the first real decision she had made for herself in years. Something had shifted inside her. Laura Whitman, the woman who had built everything for everyone else, was finally ready to reclaim her life. The fallout came faster than Laura expected. It started with Thomas storming into her office 2 days after she'd made the changes, waving a printout of the updated financial statements like a battle flag. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, slamming the papers on her desk. Laura didn't look up from her laptop. "It's called a budget. Something this family hasn't had in a long time." "You cut off funding for my studio," he snapped. "How am I supposed to finish my series?" She raised her eyes to meet his, her voice calm but firm. "Thomas, it's been years. You haven't sold a single piece. We're pouring money into something that brings nothing back. We need to prioritize." "I am working," he insisted, his voice rising. "Just because I'm not in some corporate boardroom doesn't mean my work is worthless." "I never said it was worthless," Laura replied evenly. "But it's not sustainable. The company is growing, and that growth requires investment. I can't keep funding hobbies while I'm fighting to secure our future." "Hobbies?" He laughed bitterly. "That's what you think of my art." Laura stood, exhausted already by the argument. "I think we both need to face reality. Things have to change." Thomas shook his head and stormed out, muttering under his breath about being unappreciated. The door slammed so hard the picture frames on the wall rattled. That afternoon, Ryan showed up at her office unannounced, his expression thunderous. "Are you serious right now?" he demanded before she could even greet him. "You cut my allowance." Laura sighed and gestured for him to sit. "Ryan, you're 20 years old. It's time to start thinking about your future, classes, a part-time job, anything." "Oh my God, here we go again," he groaned, pacing the floor. "You just want to control everything I do." "No," she said softly. "I want you to care about something, to take responsibility for your life." "I am responsible," he shouted, his face red with anger. "Just because I don't want your boring corporate life doesn't mean I'm a failure." "I never said you were," Laura replied, though her voice trembled now. "But parties and cars aren't a future, Ryan. They're distractions." "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You don't trust me. You don't trust anyone." He spun on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Laura stood frozen for a long moment, her heart hammering. She had known they wouldn't take it well, but the fury in his eyes, the complete lack of understanding, still pierced her. That evening, the three of them sat around the dinner table in near silence. Thomas pushed his food around his plate without eating. Ryan didn't look up from his phone. Laura tried to speak twice, but the words stuck in her throat. Everything about the meal felt cold and unfamiliar, like strangers sitting together out of obligation. Finally, she broke the silence. "I know you're both upset with me," she said quietly, "but I believe this is the right thing for all of us." Thomas scoffed, not looking at her. "You didn't even give us a chance to talk about it." "Because every time I try, you both shut me out," Laura replied, her voice steadier now. "We are a team, but a team only works if everyone contributes." Ryan said nothing. He just stared at his plate as if she weren't even there. The weight of his silence hurt more than his shouting had. Later that night, when the house had gone still, Laura stood by the kitchen window, staring out into the dark. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. She knew this was necessary. She knew she couldn't keep enabling them. But knowing didn't make the ache any less sharp. She pressed a hand to her chest. Her heartbeat felt strange, too fast, too heavy. She took a breath, then another, but the room was tilting now, the edges of her vision blurring. A cold sweat broke across her skin. The last thing she remembered was the mug slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor before the darkness swallowed everything. When Laura opened her eyes again, She was staring at a white ceiling. The steady beeping of a heart monitor filled the silence. A doctor appeared above her, his expression calm but serious. "Mrs. Whitman," he said gently, "you had a myocardial infarction, a heart attack brought on by prolonged stress. You're stable now, but you need to rest. If you don't slow down, the next one could be worse." Tears welled in Laura's eyes as the reality sank in. She had spent so long holding everything together, the company, the marriage, the family, that had nearly broken her. And if nothing changed, it would break her. For the first time in years, lying in that hospital bed, Laura admitted a truth she had avoided for too long. The life she had built was killing her. And if she wanted to survive, everything, had to change. The days in the hospital blurred into one another. A quiet hum of monitors, the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine, the muted footsteps of nurses gliding past her door. Laura lay awake most nights, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The doctor's warning echoed over and over. If you don't slow down, the next one could be worse. But slowing down had never been an option. Not when so many people depended on her. Not when the people closest to her treated her like an afterthought. It was on the third night, as the sky outside her window faded into indigo, that a dangerous thought took shape. If she wanted the truth, if she truly wanted to see who Thomas and Ryan were beneath the surface, she needed to create a situation where they would reveal themselves without knowing she was watching. The next morning, when Dr. Evans came in for his rounds, Laura asked him to sit. "Doctor," she began quietly, "I need a favor. A strange one." He raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "I don't want my husband or son to know the real reason I'm here. Don't tell them it was a heart attack. Tell them," she took a deep breath, "tell them it's stage 4 cancer, that I don't have long." Dr. Evans hesitated. "Mrs. Whitman, that's—" "Please," she interrupted. "I need to know the truth. I need to know who I'm really living with before I decide what to do with the rest of my life." Reluctantly, the doctor agreed. "All right, but you understand this could have consequences." "I understand," she said, her gaze steady. "That's the point." When Thomas arrived that afternoon, his expression was carefully composed, a mix of concern and something she couldn't quite name. He sat at her bedside and took her hand, patting it gently. "Laura, the doctor told me," he said, his voice low. "I can't believe this." She forced a weak smile, playing her part. "It's advanced. They say there's not much time." Thomas sighed deeply, but his eyes didn't fill with tears. If anything, there was a flicker of relief. And then he said it. "Is there anything you need me to handle? Have you updated the will?" The words hung in the sterile air, cold and heavy. Laura felt her stomach twist. Of all the things he could have said, "I love you, we'll fight this, I'll be here," he went straight to the paperwork. "Not yet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Well," he said, quickly, almost too quickly, "it's important to get those things settled, you know. For Ryan. For the company. I can talk to Wilson about it." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. When he left a short while later, promising to check in soon, the room felt colder than it had all week. But the real blow came from Ryan. He didn't show up that day, or the next, or the day after that. Laura called and texted him, but her messages went unanswered. Once, in the hallway, she overheard 2 nurses whispering near the door. Can you believe it? A woman with stage 4 cancer, and her husband and son barely visit. "I know," the other replied softly. "Some people really are heartless." Laura closed her eyes, willing the tears not to fall. They were talking about her. She was the woman who had given everything, and was now left to die alone. By the end of that week, her sorrow had hardened into something else entirely. Resolve. If this was who they were, if this was how little she meant to them, then they would learn what it felt like to lose what they took for granted. She picked up the phone and called her attorney. "Mr. Wilson," she said calmly, "I need to make some changes to my estate plan." Of course, he replied. What are you thinking? I want Megan Ross, my executive assistant, to assume temporary control of the company if anything happens to me. Ryan will not inherit until he demonstrates responsibility. And Thomas, she paused. Thomas is to have no control over my assets whatsoever. There was a brief silence on the other end. Understood, Wilson said finally. I'll draft the amendments and bring them over tomorrow. As Laura hung up, she stared out the window at the fading light over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The woman lying in that hospital bed was no longer the same one who had collapsed in her kitchen days ago. That woman had been desperate, clinging to a family that didn't value her. This one was done begging. Whatever came next, Thomas and Ryan would no longer coast through life on her sacrifices. The reckoning had already begun, and they didn't even know it. Days turned into weeks, and the hospital became Laura's entire world. A world of sterile white walls, quiet beeping machines, and long hours of silence. Thomas's visits, which had been brief and distracted even at the start, became increasingly rare. At first, he came every 3 or 4 days, bringing flowers he likely bought on the way in and asking perfunctory questions about her condition. But even those small gestures dwindled. Soon it was once a week, then every 10 days, and each time he seemed more impatient, more distant, as if he had somewhere else he would rather be. Ryan didn't come at all. Not once. He didn't call, didn't text. The last message she'd sent him, I miss you. Can we talk? Remained unread. Laura tried to convince herself he was busy or overwhelmed. But deep down, she knew the truth. He simply didn't care enough. One rainy afternoon, Megan stopped by after work with a stack of documents for Laura to review and sign. They talked for a while about the company's transition plan, about the expansion deal that was moving forward without a hitch. Megan hesitated before leaving, glancing at her phone. There's something you should see, she said gently, placing the phone on Laura's lap. On the screen was a photo from a local arts gala taken just the night before. Thomas was there, dressed in a tailored suit, laughing as he held the hand of a much younger woman in a red dress. They looked carefree, radiant, like a couple without a worry in the world. Laura stared at the image, the breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just betrayal. It was confirmation of everything she had feared. She had built her life around 2 people who, when faced with her suffering, simply walked away. That night, she cried silently into her pillow, her chest tightening with a pain deeper than the heart attack that had brought her here. It wasn't just the loss of their love, it was the realization that maybe it had never truly existed. But life, as it often does, had one more surprise in store. 3 days later, as she lay half dozing in the late afternoon light, the door to her room opened, and in walked Daniel Harper, carrying a bouquet of deep red roses. I heard you were here, he said softly, setting the flowers on her bedside table. I can't believe I had to find out from Megan. Laura blinked in disbelief. Daniel, what are you doing here? What does it look like? He teased gently. I came to see you, and I'm not leaving until I know you're going to be okay. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her, and for the first time in weeks, Laura felt the room fill with warmth. Daniel didn't fill the silence with meaningless words. He simply was there, asking how she felt, what she needed, telling her about the world outside the hospital walls. He even spoke to Dr. Evans, asking questions Laura had been too tired or too afraid to ask herself. Your heart needs surgery, Daniel said after the doctor left. It's risky, but it could give you your life back. Laura looked away. I don't know if I have the strength for that. Then let me lend you mine, he said, leaning forward. We'll face it together, Laura. Whatever comes, I'm here. The words cracked something open inside her, a place that had long been sealed shut. No one had spoken to her like that in years. Not Thomas. Not Ryan. No one. As the afternoon sun dipped low, Daniel reached for her hand, his voice barely above a whisper. I should tell you something. I never married. Not once. Because I never stopped thinking about you. and I couldn't give my heart to anyone else. The tears she had fought back for so long spilled freely now. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he looked at her, not with pity or obligation, but with quiet, unwavering affection. For the first time in a very long time, Laura didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like a burden or an afterthought. She felt seen. And in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines and shadows of betrayal, something small but powerful stirred in her chest, a flicker of hope. Maybe her story wasn't over. Maybe, just maybe, the best part of her life was still ahead. The morning of the surgery arrived with a soft drizzle clinging to the windows of Mission Hospital. Laura stared at the ceiling of the pre-op room, her pulse quickening with every tick of the clock. No matter how many boardroom deals she had negotiated or crises she had weathered, nothing compared to the fear that gripped her now. This was her heart, fragile, failing, and the surgeon's hands would decide if she would walk out of this building alive. Daniel was there, of course. He had been there every day since he first walked through her door with roses. That morning, he held her hand, his thumb tracing small circles on her skin. "You're going to be fine," he said quietly. "And when you wake up, I'll be right here." Her voice shook. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then I'll still be right here," he answered, with a certainty that steadied her. They wheeled her into the operating room shortly after sunrise. The sterile lights above blurred into a white haze as the anesthesia crept through her veins. Her last memory before sleep was Daniel's face above her, smiling softly, and the warmth of his hand lingering in hers. The surgery lasted 5 hours. Outside the double doors of the operating suite, Daniel paced the hallway, coffee forgotten in his hand, eyes fixed on the red in progress light. Nurses came and went. Hours crawled by. When the surgeon finally emerged, removing his gloves with a satisfied sigh, Daniel felt his knees nearly give out. "She's stable," the doctor said. "The operation went as well as we hoped. She's going to need time, but she's going to be okay." Daniel didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until it escaped in a rush. When Laura opened her eyes hours later, groggy and disoriented, the first thing she saw was Daniel sitting beside her bed, his head resting against the rail as he dozed in a chair. A single rose lay on the table, next to a stack of books and a paper cup of cold coffee. As if sensing her gaze, he stirred and sat up, his face lighting up with relief. "Hey," he whispered, leaning closer. "Welcome back." Laura's lips trembled into a faint smile. "You're still here." "I told you I would be." The days that followed were slow but steady. Daniel visited every morning, often before sunrise, bringing fresh flowers from the market or pastries from her favorite bakery. He read aloud from the novels they had loved in college, filling the sterile room with laughter and warmth. On difficult days when the pain felt unbearable or her body seemed too weak to recover, he simply held her hand and reminded her of all the reasons she had to keep fighting. Weeks later, when Laura was strong enough to walk without assistance, Daniel appeared one morning with a small envelope in his hand. "What's this?" she asked, still in her robe. "An idea," he said, grinning. "Come away with me, just for a little while, somewhere by the ocean. Fresh air, no responsibilities, no pressure, just you and me." At first, she hesitated. It felt reckless, indulgent even. But then she remembered the woman who had collapsed in her kitchen, suffocating under the weight of everyone else's needs. That woman was gone. The one who remained deserved to breathe. 2 weeks later, they arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, a coastal town where the sea met the sky in endless blue and the salt wind carried whispers of second chances. They rented a small cottage near the water, its porch overlooking a stretch of pale sand. Each morning, they walked barefoot along the shoreline, collecting shells like they had as teenagers. In the evenings, they sat on the porch with glasses of wine, talking until the stars emerged. They spoke of everything: their childhood dreams, the paths they'd taken, the regrets they carried. Daniel confessed how often he'd thought of her over the years, How many times he had wondered, what if? Laura shared how deeply she had buried herself in duty, how much of her own life she had given away without noticing. Somewhere in those conversations, amid the laughter and the silences, something shifted. The grief she had carried for so long began to loosen its hold. The anger and betrayal that had once defined her started to fade. She felt lighter, freer, as if each tide that kissed the shore washed away a small part of her past. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Daniel turned to her with a gentle smile. "You know," he said, "this feels like the beginning of something." Laura looked out at the sea, the wind tugging softly at her hair. For the first time in years, the future didn't terrify her. It beckoned. "It does," she whispered. "It really does." And in that quiet moment, Laura realized she was no longer the woman who had been left behind. She was someone new, someone alive, hopeful, and ready to build a life not out of obligation, but out of choice. By the time Laura returned to Asheville, the air had shifted. The weeks by the ocean had done more than heal her body. They had reset something deep inside her. The woman stepping out of the car in front of Whitman and company headquarters was not the same woman who had collapsed in her kitchen weeks before. She was stronger now, steadier, and she was done apologizing for the weight she carried. Still, that first morning back wasn't without nerves. As she stood in the lobby of the glass-fronted building her father had once walked through every day, Laura felt a flicker of doubt. Would her team still believe in her after her absence? Had the company shifted without her at the helm? She took a deep breath and pushed the thought aside. Doubt had no place here anymore. The doors to the executive floor slid open, and a ripple of applause greeted her. "Welcome back, Mrs. Whitman," one of the junior managers said, beaming. Megan appeared beside her with a stack of reports in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other, just the way Laura liked it. "Everything's on schedule," Megan said. "We've kept the expansion plan moving. Marketing's ready for final approval, and legal has a few contracts they want you to review." Laura smiled, a rare softness in her eyes. "Good work. Let's get started." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings. She reviewed financial forecasts with the accounting team, strategized with marketing about the company's new product launch, and negotiated the final details of their international deal over a call with investors in London. At every step, she felt the familiar fire return, the sense of purpose that had always driven her but had been buried under exhaustion and resentment. When Daniel arrived just before lunch, carrying 2 sandwiches and his signature easy smile, she felt another kind of warmth spread through her. "Thought you might forget to eat," he teased. "Not a chance," she replied, laughing. "I'm running on real food now, not just adrenaline." Daniel had joined Whitman and Company as a formal partner during her recovery, bringing his logistics expertise and extensive network to the table. Together, they made decisions as equals, a refreshing change from the one-sided compromises Laura had been forced into for years. He challenged her when she needed it, supported her when things grew heavy, and reminded her that leadership didn't have to mean loneliness. Over the next few weeks, the company began to transform. New partnerships blossomed. Revenue climbed. Employees who had once shuffled nervously through meetings now spoke with confidence and initiative, inspired by Laura's renewed energy. There was laughter in the halls again, a sense of momentum that everyone could feel. Even the board, once skeptical of her aggressive expansion plans, now praised her vision and leadership. In the evenings, Laura and Daniel would walk through the quiet streets of downtown Asheville, talking about the future. Sometimes they spoke of business, new markets, innovative strategies, but often they talked about life. The books they loved, the places they wanted to see, the dreams they had never spoken aloud to anyone else. Their bond deepened, rooted not in need or convenience, but in respect and choice. Laura often found herself thinking, "This is the life I was meant to live," not the one defined by endless sacrifice, by carrying others who refused to stand on their own. This life, balanced, vibrant, shared, was hers. But the past has a way of finding its way back, even when you've shut the door. It happened one gray afternoon as Laura was finishing a meeting with her legal team. Megan stepped into her office, her expression unusually tense. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Two someones, actually." Laura didn't have to ask who. A familiar chill slid down her spine. Moments later, the door opened, and there they were, Thomas and Ryan. Time had not been kind to either of them. Thomas looked older than she remembered, heavier, his once carefree expression hardened by bitterness. Ryan's swagger was gone, replaced by something quieter, more calculating. "Laura," Thomas began, his voice measured, "we need to talk." "About what?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "About the future," he said. "About the estate. About what happens when you're gone." Ryan shifted uneasily beside him, avoiding her gaze. "We just want to understand what we're entitled to," he mumbled. Laura leaned back in her chair, her hands folded calmly on the desk. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply studying the two people who had once been her entire world. They hadn't come for reconciliation. They hadn't come because they missed her. They had come for money. The ache in her chest was familiar, but it no longer consumed her. Instead, she felt a strange, quiet power settle over her. They believed she was still the same woman they had abandoned, fragile, desperate, waiting for their approval. They had no idea how much she had changed. "Then I suppose," Laura said softly, her eyes steady, "we'll have plenty to discuss." The rain was falling in steady sheets the morning Laura stepped into the downtown law office, the rhythmic patter against the windows matching the measured beat of her heart. It had been nearly 3 months since the heart attack, 3 months since she'd rewritten her will and reshaped her life. Today was the final act. The reckoning she had quietly prepared for was about to unfold. Inside the oak-paneled conference room, Thomas and Ryan were already seated at the long mahogany table. They hadn't seen her since that tense meeting weeks ago, and they clearly weren't expecting her today. They sat side by side, whispering excitedly, their tones light, almost giddy. "Once the estate is settled, I'll take the lake house," Thomas was saying. "You can have the townhouse in Charlotte. We'll figure out the company shares after." Ryan smirked. "I'll take controlling interest. I've got some investment ideas. Maybe I'll finally do something with Whitman and Company. Worth more than Mom ever did." Their laughter grated, but Laura didn't flinch. She stood just outside the doorway for a heartbeat longer, gathering herself. This wasn't about anger anymore. This was about truth. Mr. Wilson, her attorney, cleared his throat as he entered behind her. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. Before we proceed, there's someone else who needs to be present." The door opened fully and Laura stepped inside. The reaction was immediate. Thomas froze mid-sentence, his face draining of color. Ryan's jaw fell open. Mom," he stammered, half rising from his chair. You're supposed to be dead." Laura finished for him, her tone calm, almost casual. "I know. That's what you were counting on, wasn't it?" Thomas recovered first, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The doctor said what I asked him to say," Laura interrupted. "I never had cancer. I had a heart attack, and I needed to know who I could trust." She looked from father to son, her gaze steady and cold. "Now I do." Silence blanketed the room. Ryan sank slowly back into his chair, his face a mask of shock. "You lied to us," he whispered. "I tested you," Laura corrected, "and you failed." Thomas shot to his feet, anger breaking through his disbelief. "How dare you play games like this? Do you have any idea what that put us through?" Laura arched an eyebrow. "You mean the burden of not visiting? Of not calling? Of asking about the will while I was supposedly dying?" Her voice sharpened. "Do you know what you put me through? Years of sacrifice while you painted in that garage, pretending to be an artist. Years of watching Ryan throw away every opportunity because he knew I'd always clean up the mess. And when you thought I was dying, you both disappeared." Ryan slammed his palm on the table. "We're family," he shouted. "You don't just cut family off." "Family," Laura repeated, her tone icy. "Family doesn't abandon you when you're fighting for your life. Family doesn't ask about inheritance before asking how you're feeling. Family doesn't treat your death like a payday." Her words hit their mark. Ryan's face twisted with anger and shame. Thomas opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Laura reached into her leather folder and pulled out a stack of documents. She placed them neatly on the table and slid them toward Thomas. "These are notices of eviction. You have 30 days to vacate the lake house. It was purchased in my name and remains legally mine." She turned to Ryan. "The vehicles you use are registered under the company. Return them by the end of the week." Thomas's face turned crimson. "You can't do this." "I already have," Laura said coolly, "and you'll find your access to the joint accounts has been revoked. There will be no more withdrawals, no more monthly transfers, no more funding your lifestyles with money you didn't earn." Ryan rose from his seat, his hands shaking. "You can't just erase us." "I'm not erasing anyone," Laura replied. "I'm giving you both what you've always needed, a chance to stand on your own 2 feet. Thomas glared at her with a hatred she had never seen before. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I regret every day I allowed myself to be treated like a wallet instead of a wife, like a bank instead of a mother. Those regrets end today." For a long moment, no one moved. Rain lashed the windows. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and then Thomas gathered his coat with jerky, furious movements and stormed toward the door. Ryan lingered a moment longer, his eyes wet, his mouth opening as if to speak, but in the end he said nothing. He followed his father out, the door slamming shut behind them. Laura stood alone in the conference room, her heartbeat steady. It was over. The confrontation she had dreaded for so long had finally happened, and though her chest ached, though the emptiness they left behind still stung, she felt something else too, something fierce and liberating. Power. For the first time in decades, Laura Whitman wasn't bending to someone else's will. She wasn't cleaning up their messes or financing their mistakes. She was standing on her own. And that, she realized as she watched the rain streak the glass, was worth every ounce of pain it took to get here. The heavy door of the law office closed behind Thomas and Ryan with a dull thud, their footsteps echoing down the corridor until the sound disappeared completely. Laura remained standing by the window for a long while after they were gone, watching the rain ease into a soft drizzle. The city below bustled as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, as if her entire life hadn't shifted in the span of a single conversation. And yet everything had changed. For years, she had believed she needed them, that without Thomas and Ryan, her world would crumble. But now, as silence settled over the room, she felt something else instead, lightness. It was as though a weight she had carried for decades had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The chains of obligation, guilt, and fear had fallen away, leaving only clarity in their place. The next morning, Laura met with her attorney again, this time for something she had put off far too long. "I want to file for divorce," she said calmly as Mr. Wilson opened his briefcase. "I'm done." "Of course," he replied with a nod. "We'll start the paperwork today." The proceedings dragged on for months, as Thomas contested every term and Ryan sent angry messages that swung between fury and pleading. But Laura didn't waver. She attended every hearing, signed every document, and refused to back down. Each step brought her closer to the life she had always deserved but had been too afraid to claim. 6 months later, on a bright spring afternoon, Laura walked out of the courthouse with the final decree in her hands. She was no longer Mrs. Thomas Whitman. She was simply Laura, and for the first time in her adult life, that was enough. That summer, under a canopy of blooming dogwoods in a small garden behind a historic inn in Asheville, Laura stood in a simple ivory dress as Daniel took her hands. Their wedding was intimate, Just a handful of friends, a few close colleagues, and Megan smiling proudly from the front row. There were no extravagant speeches, no grand gestures. Just vows whispered through tears and smiles, promises built not on need but on trust, respect, and love. As they exchanged rings, Laura felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the spring sun. This wasn't a second chance at the same old story. This was something entirely new, a partnership born not from sacrifice, but from choice. Together, Laura and Daniel set about building a new life. They restructured Whitman and Company, expanding its reach into international markets and launching mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs, an ideal Laura had dreamed of but never had the bandwidth to pursue before. Daniel's logistics expertise helped streamline operations, while Laura's vision pushed the company into new territories. Their partnership thrived not just in the boardroom, but at home, too. Evenings were no longer silent and strained. They were filled with shared meals, laughter, and quiet conversations about the future. Laura also began to reclaim the parts of herself she had long buried. She took painting classes at a local studio, something she had once dismissed as Thomas's thing. She started running again, savoring the quiet of Asheville's forest trails. And most importantly, she allowed herself to dream, not just about the company or her responsibilities, but about the life she and Daniel could create together. Sometimes, in the stillness of early morning, Laura would sit by the window of their new home, a craftsman-style house with wide porches and a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and reflect on the journey that had brought her here. The betrayal, the abandonment, the nights of loneliness and fear, they had once felt like the end of everything. But in truth, they had been the beginning. They had stripped away what was false and hollow, leaving space for something real to grow. She thought, too, of Thomas and Ryan. She didn't hate them. The anger that had once burned so fiercely had cooled into something gentler, a distant ache, a quiet lesson. They had made their choices, and now they would have to live with them. And perhaps in time they would learn what she had learned, that love built on dependency is not love at all. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the mountains gold, Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind as they stood on the porch. "You look peaceful," he murmured. "I am," Laura said softly. "For the first time in my life, I truly am." She leaned into him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Ahead of her stretched a future she had once thought impossible, one not defined by sacrifice or survival, but by joy, purpose, and choice. Laura Whitman knew that her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. And this time, every chapter would belong entirely to her.